Hello, everyone. Okay, so we're going to be taking notes today, and welcome to the new section. I hope you did well on the test, and if you did not score well on your interactive notebook, you can go ahead and fix it and turn it in as soon as possible so it can be regraded. Okay, so here we have a picture of several types of bunnies. We've got some offspring of some other breeding two kinds of bunnies together. So we've got a brown bunny at the top and a brown bunny as the father and the mother, and but they produce like a white rabbit with red eyes, as you can see there. And then sometimes you get a white rabbit and a white rabbit, and they produce another white rabbit. So how can both two brown rabbits as well as two brown rabbits make a white rabbit, and another two white bunnies can also make a white rabbit. So how do these things happen in nature? So that's going to be the beginning of our study of Mendelian genetics, which came much before. So let's talk a little bit about Mendel and what he did. Okay, so this is the beginning of your notes. So the title is Chapter 11, Section 1, and it's basically going to be covering the work of Gregor Mendel. So we're going to be talking about who he was and what he discovered, and what he studied was how organisms pass their characteristics off to their offspring. So people forever have been interested in how things get passed on from one generation to the next. And as soon as farming came along, first it was just people, but then farmers came along and they wanted to know, well, people like things like this, and they buy more of this color things. So they started trying to breed things together that made certain things that they can sell or that they liked to eat more, that had no, more nutritional value. So people started breeding different things together, and that has always interested people to not only food sources, but also like when we see babies being born, we want to know, well, what's the baby going to look like based on these parents? So that's what was studied by him. So let's get started. So, Gregor Mendel is known as a father of genetics. He studied heredity. What is heredity? Heredity is how traits are passed from one generation to the next. And he interestingly decided to study pea plants. He was a monk, so he actually grew, and his job was to grow the food or plants for the monastery and make sure everyone was fed. And so in his growing, he started noticing that pea plants were easy to study, and so he decided to study how the inheritance were inherit how pea plants inherited to the next generation, and because of this, he gained great knowledge about how genetics works in general. So we're going to talk more about this and how he discovered it. So, uh, Gregor Mendel was born in 1822. He worked at a monastery of St. Thomas in the Czech Republic. He was a teacher. He taught math and science, and he was, like I mentioned before, he was also in charge of the garden at the monastery where he lived. And after, growing things, he decided to work on pea plants, perform experiments on them. Why pea plants? Well, there was various reasons why he chose pea plants. He didn't just choose anything. He was growing many other things, but he decided to do pea plants. So, why was it that he chose those plants? So, the reason why he chose pea plants is because first he discovered, like many other people that grow peas, is that they're easy to grow. So that was a very important feature. The second another important feature that they had is that they were able to self-fertilize. That means that the pollen from the same flower could actually join up with the egg of the same flower, and basically it pollinates itself. So it was able to self-fertilize. In addition, not only could it self-fertilize, if a little bit of pollen from one plant got onto the flower of another plant, it could also create peas from that too. So it was not only able to self-pollinate, it could also hybridize with a different plant. A very good feature that it also has is that it grows quickly. He didn't have to wait years and years because if anyone's ever tried, genetic studies on humans, you're waiting for years. We wait so long to have offspring, but in this case, he noted that peas grew fast. Also, that they had very contrasting traits. and that were easy for him to see. He didn't have to like, oh, is that really, oh, that one's only medium red, that one's red red, and that no, he knew that pea plants had like either white flowers or purple flowers. There was no in between. There and it was like you couldn't confuse the white flowers with the purple flowers. They were very different. Some plants were tall and some were short. He never had medium plants. He always had tall plants or short plants. So they were really easy to see traits. So those were the ones he decided to study. So that's why he chose pea plants. So, fertilization is a process in which a male and female reproductive cells join. So, fertilization is not sex. It's actually just the joining of eggs with pollen or eggs with sperm. That is fertilization. So once again, he kind of gave different names to things. So self-fertilization meant that it was only one parent was producing the offspring. So they would produce identical offspring to the parents, and he called this true breeding. So basically, when the plant that, like, if it was a white plant, he made sure that he used the pollen from that same plant to fertilize the white flower. And every time he did that, they produced plants that made white flowers every single time. So he called this true breeding. Now, cross pollination, that's when he basically created hybrids. Or, in other words, he got the pollen from one and put it on something that was different. So, so he got the plant that produced white flowers, got the pollen from that, and put it on the plant that produced purple flowers. And he created hybrids from those. So he combined different ones together, and he called those hybrids, and they were hybrid because they were cross pollinated, two parents. Um, and he kept very careful records that actually had been lost for many years, but were rediscovered years after his death. And then they were seen for what they really were, the value that they had, because he had such good records that people were able to find out all kinds of stuff. So here you have his technique and what he did. He basically, when he was working with the flowers, he made sure that he was controlling everything. So basically, he removed the stamens from the purple flowers, and this is the way he made hybrids. And he controlled everything. So the carpel has the egg. That's where the egg is. So he removed all the stamens where all the pollen was, and he basically put them on the white flower, the white carpel, and then he did the same thing with the white flowers. He got all of the stamens from the white ones and he pollinated the purple ones. So that's how he was able to do that. So step two, he transfers pollen from the stamens of white flowers to the carpel of the purple flowers. And then he pollinates the carpel. He lets the pollinated carpels mature, and that turns into a little pea pod. And then he planted those seeds and then saw what he got. And those were like the hybrids that he made. And so he saw their offspring. So, and he called them the F1 offspring, and he called the parents the P generation. So we have the P generation, the original ones, the white and the purple, and they make created offspring. And you can see here what color the flowers were. They were all purple. So that's the kind of crossing he did, and that's how he did it. And he basically coined the term trait, and he called a trait a specific characteristic that varies from one individual to another. So that's what we know as traits. So when someone has, oh, I have these traits, well, that's what makes you different from another individual. Okay, so fertilization is the process when a male and female reproductive cells join. True breeding is when flowers pollinate to produce off identical offspring, so self-pollination. And hybrids are offspring produced from two different parents. And he looked at these seven traits here in this picture. He looked at wrinkled and round, and green and yellow, and gray and white coat, sorry, pod shape. There was some that were smooth pea pods. There were some that were constricted. In other words, kind of like wrinkled up. And some were green, some were yellow. Some produced flowers all over the place. Some of them just produced flowers on the top, so flower positions. And plant height, he compared. There were some plants that were tall and some plants that were short. So those are the seven traits that he decided to look at. Okay, so these are the tests that he did. He basically got the parent generation. The P ones were all the different ones, the seven traits. the F1 generation came out with only one trait of the parents. So they took after only one of the parents, not a combination of both of the parents, like many people thought. Many people thought that if you combined a round with a wrinkled uh, seed, you would wind up with a little bit wrinkled, not less wrinkled seed. But no, they came out. The offspring were all round peas. They all made round peas. When he combined the flowers that made the yellow peas with the flowers that made the plants that made green peas, all of their kids wound up just making yellow peas. They made no green peas. When he combined some that produced gray and white, different parents, all of the kids wound up with gray, no whites. When he combined those that were smooth with the plants that produced constricted, all of their kids wound up with smooth ones. Green and yellow pods, well, all of the kids wound up with green pods. So if the one parent had axial flowers and the other one had terminal flowers, all of the offspring had axial flowers. Um, One that was tall, all the parents were tall and all the parents were short, and the other parent was short. All of the kids wound up tall. So something happened there. He was like, "Well, what happened to the other one? The other trait? Did it just disappear? Is it still there?" So they were not mixes at all. They were actually just took after one of the parents. So he wondered what had happened to the other trait. Okay, so this led to his first conclusion. Somehow he didn't know about DNA or anything. So somehow he concluded that traits are determined by these things inside of the cells called genes. So what was a gene? A factor that are passed from what is passed on from one generation to the next. He called these factors, we call them genes, and they control each trait. And that there's different forms of each gene, and we call those alleles. So alleles are different forms of a particular gene. So here we've got like the allele for brown eyes and the allele for blue eyes, the allele for dark hair, the allele for brown hair, blonde hair, gene for smart, not so smart, rolling tongue, not rolling tongue. So those are different versions of a gene. So different versions, different forms of a gene, we call it the alleles. So instead of saying different types, we say different types of genes, we just say, oh no, those are the alleles of that gene. We're not talking, that's basically means the same thing. Different types of genes are not called, we don't refer to them as that. We do refer to them as alleles, which means different types of genes. Okay, so the second conclusion that he also figured out through his experiments is that it's called the principle of dominance. So what that means is that some alleles or some versions of the gene are dominant and some of them are recessive. The ones that are dominant show up in the kids. The ones that are recessive disappear when they have kids. So that he just figured some were dominant and some were recessive. Some were stronger. Some alleles were stronger than others. So we've got recessive and dominant alleles. That was the second principle. Okay. So, and then he decided that he would use the one that was dominant, he gave it a capital letter, and the one that was recessive, he gave it a lowercase letter. That's the way it works. So, when he was doing his math, and how we're going to do it too, is that when we get a dominant allele or a form of a gene that is dominant, how do we know if it's dominant? Well, if we mix the two together, all the kids wind up looking like the dominant one. So, that would be a dominant allele, and we always those we use capital letters. So if tall is dominant to short, we use a capital T for tall if we want, and so that's the way it works. Okay, so here we've got dominant allele, capital letters, shape, round. Round is dominant to wrinkled. We use lowercase r, not L or W for wrinkled. If it's a dominant one, you pick a letter for the dominant one, and that's the capital. And for the recessive one of that same trait for that gene, we use the same letter but the lowercase. Notice we don't use little w for wrinkled. We use big R for round, and because round is dominant, you have to use little r for wrinkled. Okay. And how do you know which one's dominant and which is recessive? Well, you have to be told. Like you have to do an experiment to see which one's dominant and recessive. And Mendel already did that experiment for us when he mixed when the plants that produced the round seeds with the plants that produced wrinkled seeds, and he basically planted those seeds. When he combined them, they always had kids that were had round seeds. None of them had wrinkled. So that's how we found out that round was dominant to wrinkled. Also the same letter of the alphabet, like I said. If brown is dominant to blue, we use the big B for brown and the little b for blue. Not the little b is linked, so we use the uppercase, same letter of the alphabet, uppercase and lowercase, to signify that they go for the same gene. They're different alleles of the same gene. Okay, so it was kind of weird. Had recessive disappeared. He asked himself after doing all those crosses, he's like, what had happened to those genes or the versions that had disappeared? It seemed like if he planted tall plants and with combined tall plants with short plants, all their kids wound up being tall. So what happened to the short information? Did it disappear? Is it still there? So what he did was that he allowed the plants that the F1 generation to have peas, and then he planted those peas, and then he kind of saw tried to figure out so what happened, and that's where he started to see that roughly 1/4 of the F2 plants, he called these the second, they're the grandchildren, the F2 plants, about 1/4 of them actually had that trait again. So it reappeared in the next generation, but only in about a quarter of the offspring. So that trait, that recessive allele, had not disappeared. It was still there. It was just hidden, and it reappeared in the next generation. And he wondered why that was. Okay, so like I was saying before, in the second generation, traits controlled by the recessive allele reappeared. So roughly 1/4 of the F2 offspring showed the recessive trait. So he really started wondering why is that, and he repeated this experiment over and over with all of the 7 traits, and he saw them reappearing in the F2 generation, or the grandkids. So he started doing some math, crunching the numbers, and he figured out an explanation. Okay, and the next section, what we're going to do is that we're going to look at the kind of math he used to figure out how 1/4 of the offspring wound up having that trait reemerge. So the subject of the next lecture will be the math involved with coming out with 1/4 of the population having the recessive offspring again in the F2 generation. So stay tuned. We're going to do the second lecture, and make sure you took thorough notes, and we're going to go over some probability information. So hopefully you're going to be familiar with that from your math class, but he was a mathematician after all, so he used his math to figure out why it was that the traits reappeared.